Hi students, welcome to Easy Elimu Learning Simplified. My name is Mbithe, and in today's session, we're going to look at clauses, independent clauses, and subordinate clauses. We are going to define both of them, give the difference between each of them, and also examples of all of them. So before we go further into it, it's important to have a definition of what a clause is, and a clause is defined as a group of words that includes a subject and a verb. It can form a sentence on its own like that, or it can form a part of a sentence. And so there are two types of clauses. We have the independent clauses and the subordinate clauses. So an independent clause, just from the word independent, means that it is a clause that can stand on its own. It is a clause that can make sense on its own. So it can form a sentence on its own. And so it also has a subject and a verb. So we are going to look at some sentences and attempt to pick out or to identify the independent clauses in these sentences. The first sentence: I know how to drive a car, but I enjoy riding bikes. So when you look at the first part of that sentence, I know how to drive a car. I is the subject, drive is the verb. So I know how to drive a car is an independent clause. But I enjoy riding bikes. That part of the sentence cannot stand on its own. It does not make sense on its own. So it is not an independent clause. Today is Wednesday. Does that sentence make sense on its own? Yes, it does. And that is the independent clause. The teacher gave me a novel and I read it from cover to cover. The teacher gave me a novel and I read it from cover to cover. The teacher gave me a novel is an independent clause because it does make sense on its own. It can stand on its own and be a sentence on its own. The subject is the teacher and the verb is give. The other part of that sentence, and I read it from cover to cover, does not make sense on its own. It was my brother's graduation yesterday, but he did not want to throw a party. It was my brother's graduation yesterday is an independent clause, and but he did not want to throw a party is not an independent clause. Your food is delicious, but I can't take another bite. So your food is delicious. That is the independent clause. And lastly, they will come over after lunch. They will come over after lunch. So they will come over is an independent clause. After lunch is not. So in these sentences, you have seen that they have a part of the sentence that is the independent clause and one that is not. So we are going to see this part of the sentence that is not an independent clause. What is it and what is it called? So from the previous examples, we have seen that there's a part of the sentence that does not make sense on its own, and we have said it is not an independent clause, and it is called a subordinate clause. And a subordinate clause is introduced by a subordinating conjunction. For example, because, but, or those are called subordinating conjunctions, and they are the ones that introduce a subordinate clause. Subordinate clauses can also be called dependent, and just from the name dependent, it means that it cannot stand on its own. It depends on the independent clause for it to have a meaning. So without the independent clause, the subordinate clause cannot make sense. So we are going to still look at the same sentences, but this time we are going to identify the subordinate clause. I know how to drive a car, but I enjoy riding bikes. So the subordinate clause is, but I enjoy riding bikes. The subordinating conjunction is but. This is the subordinating conjunction that introduces this subordinate clause. So if you want to identify a subordinate clause in a sentence, first of all, start by looking for the subordinating conjunction. The teacher gave me a novel and I read it from cover to cover. So we identify the subordinating conjunction and. So, and I read it from cover to cover is the subordinate clause. It was my brother's graduation yesterday, but he did not want to throw a party. So we go and look for the subordinating conjunction. In this sentence, it is but. So, but he did not want to throw a party is the subordinate clause. Your food is delicious, but I can't take another bite. We identify the subordinating conjunction but. So, but I can't take another bite is a subordinate clause. And lastly, they will come over after lunch. So the first thing is to identify the subordinating conjunction, which is after. So after lunch is the subordinate clause of this particular sentence. So we are going to have a look at a few sentences, and this time we are going to attempt to identify both the independent clause and the subordinate clause. Since we could not agree, we thought it wise not to sign the contract. When you look at this sentence, what is the independent clause and what is the subordinate clause? In this sentence, it has started with the subordinate clause, since we could not agree. Since is the subordinating conjunction. And because this sentence has started with the subordinate clause, we have to put a comma after that clause. So since we could not agree is the subordinate clause, and then we thought it wise not to sign the contract is the independent clause. It can make sense on its own. It can stand on its own. She looks up to him because he has a lot of experience. So the first thing to do is to identify the subordinating conjunction because. So because introduces the subordinate clause. So because he has a lot of experience is the subordinate clause. She looks up to him is the independent clause. Before noon, the plane will take off to Lamu. Before noon, the plane will take off to Lamu. The first thing is to identify the subordinating conjunction, which is before. And like the first sentence, this sentence has started with the subordinate clause. So the subordinate clause is before noon, and the independent clause is the plane will take off to Lamu. Though the man was hungry, he could not eat the delicious meal. This sentence also starts with the subordinate clause. Though the man was hungry, that is the subordinate clause. He could not eat the delicious meal is the independent clause. And lastly, before he got the results, they all looked tense and worried. Before he got the results is the subordinate clause because it starts with the subordinating conjunction, and then they all looked tense and worried is the independent clause. So that's it for this session. I hope you have understood and you're able to distinguish between an independent clause and a subordinate clause, and you're also able to identify subordinating conjunctions. So for further practice, you can have a look at the quiz there. You're required to identify the independent clauses in those sentences. Thank you for tuning in and see you in the next session.